My name is Chris Paxson, and I'm Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to a discussion titled John F. Kennedy and Civil Rights 50 Years After. This event is being held in conjunction with the Sealy G. Mudd Manuscript Library's year-long exhibition on the 50th anniversary of President John F. Kennedy's election and inauguration. This is a really special event because it brings together 3 Princeton alumni: John Doar, class of 44, Nicholas Katzenbach, class of 45, and Harrison Jay Goldin, class of 57, all of whom were civil rights advocates who played pivotal roles in ending racial segregation in America. So thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. It's really wonderful. I would like to introduce Tom Putnam, who will introduce the panelists and moderate the discussion. Tom received his MPA from the Woodrow Wilson School in 1987. He joined the John F. Kennedy Library as their Director of Education in 1999, and after serving as Deputy Director and Acting Director, was named Director in 2007. Tom was instrumental in the launch of a new website and the building of new digital archives, and he's overseen the planning and design of a proposed $22 million building addition project that will provide the library with extra space to store President Kennedy's papers. I had the pleasure of participating in an event at the Kennedy Library last year. Tom invited me up, and it's a wonderful place. And that was on Senator Edward Kennedy's legacy to children and child policy. And so it's really nice to be able to return the favor and invite him back to lead our panel discussion today. So welcome, Tom.
Well, thank you very much. It's quite an honor for me to be here. I'm deeply indebted to the education I received and the financial generosity that allowed me to attend this institution and the opportunities that it has provided me in my lifetime. It's wonderful to see Ruth Miller and Ann DeMarchi Corwin, people who were connected to my being here during those days, and also to be here with Dean Paxson and Elizabeth Donahue. We collaborated, as she said, on a wonderful event that Dean Paxson moderated with Chris Dodd and Marion Wright Nettleman. So again, it's wonderful for me to be here, and as one small way that I feel that I can repay all of the wonderful things that came to me by being at this institution is I have had a career in public service and expect that my full career will be in the public sector. And some people don't know, but presidential libraries are actually, I'm a federal employee, and we're part of the National Archives and Records Administration. But it's perhaps an even greater honor to be on a panel with these gentlemen who really are heroes of our time, and individuals that we've invited a number of times up to the Kennedy Library to discuss really the pivotal role that the Justice Department played in the 1960s, headed by Attorney General Robert Kennedy. That'll be our focus today, really, is just looking at what the role of the Justice Department in advancing civil rights in our country. I'm going to introduce our speakers individually and then ask an opening question to each of them. And I thought I would begin with Nicholas Katzenbach, who served in the Justice Department in a number of roles. Most notably, he was Deputy Attorney General under Robert F. Kennedy, and then succeeded him to serve as Attorney General during the first years of the Johnson presidency. One of his original interests when he came to Washington was actually foreign policy. So even though he was Attorney General in the middle of the Johnson administration, he chose to go over to the State Department and work under Dean Rusk. The picture or the video that most school children are likely to see of Mr. Katzenbach captures that moment when he stood eyeball to eyeball, well, not quite eyeball to eyeball, you were a little bit taller than George Wallace, at the schoolhouse door in the University of Alabama at the moment where they were integrating the university with 2 talented African-American students, Vivian Malone and James Hood. And he tells the story that George Wallace was somewhat cagey, and Wallace stayed on the other side of that schoolhouse door where it was nicely air-conditioned until they had their confrontation. It was a sweltering hot day, and then even when Wallace came out, he was sure that he stayed in the shade while Mr. Katzenbach was in the blistering sun. But as we all know, he maintained his cool, and the U.S. government prevailed on that day, and those students were enrolled. And I was thinking of that confrontation when I read his memoir. he also tells a story when he was serving as Attorney General to Lyndon Johnson, and you've probably all seen those famous photos of how Johnson would lean over his adversaries and kind of intimidate them, and Mr. Katzenbach notes that he was about the same height as President Johnson. When he tried that trick on him once, he just stuck out his jaw and held his ground and actually convinced Johnson to his side of the issue that they were debating. So whether it's with George Wallace or Lyndon Johnson, he's a man who has maintained his thoughtful composure and really is a credit to the Justice Department and the issues that he stood for. So I wanted to ask him an opening question. Mr. Katzenbach, in your memoir, you talk about going to an event in 2001 where they named the Justice Department after Robert Kennedy. But you write about actually, even though President Bush and then Attorney General Ashcroft said nice things about Robert Kennedy, you didn't feel they captured the Bobby that you knew or the Justice Department that you experienced. And I wondered if you could share with this audience, what was it like to work for Robert Kennedy, and what was that Justice Department like?
Well, I enjoyed working for Bobby Kennedy. That wasn't because he didn't want you to work, because he did. But I said that primarily when I was thinking of it was towards the end of the time he was Attorney General, and perhaps particularly before his brother was assassinated. Bobby had built the Department of Justice into a place that had morale that was sky high. I mean, he had made every attorney's opinion in the Department of Justice is worth 2 of any other attorney anywhere in the government. And everybody was, I think everybody in the department, whatever they were doing, was working terribly hard and wanted to please this young Attorney General. If I go back 3 years before that to when he was named Attorney General and sworn in as Attorney General, he was the most controversial appointment that Jack Kennedy made. He was too young to be Attorney General. He was too inexperienced to be Attorney General. He was far too political to be Attorney General. And this was going to be a disaster. All of those things are absolutely true. The only thing about Bobby is that he's not a good person to challenge. He was not a good person to say you can't do something, because if you said you can't do it, he'd do it. And so what he determined to do, which I think to a large extent he did, was the best thing he could do for his brother was to build the best Department of Justice that he was capable of building. And despite the fact that he had all this criticism, and he continued to get criticism throughout his first years, not so much for what he did as for what he didn't do, mainly from civil rights people who were beaten up, and why wasn't he protecting them? Why wasn't the Attorney General doing more? Why wasn't the President doing more? And Bobby just soldiered on. He had put into place in the department the best people that he could find, and they were good. And he wanted to run it the way the department should be run. And that is, he wanted a department that was devoted to law. Obviously, he wanted to help his brother, but he thought the biggest help he could bring to his brother was to have a department that was not political and that was determined to carry out the law as the law was and to see that it was enforced. He had a lot of criticism for being, too tough, too relentless, so forth. Mainly came out of his experience where he had been in the Senate with on a committee with Senator McCarthy. And he brought to the department some experience with respect to organized crime, with respect to Jimmy Hoffa. And these were subjects which people criticized because they thought he was going to take away all of their rights and prosecute them indiscriminately, which he did not do. But what people didn't understand is that Bobby did have a quarrel with Jimmy Hoffa, and he did have a quarrel with organized crime. And it wasn't quite what you'd expect. What it was those people were interfering with good government. And Bobby believed in government that was good, that didn't take bribes, that did the best it could, as honestly as it could. And that was why he wanted to prosecute those people, because he didn't believe in corruption. And I'll finish with this note, that is the kind of department he had. The first time, we had a couple of cases early that were very important. One was a charge against a judge in New York who was the brother of the congressman, had probably been as responsible as anybody for Jack Kennedy's nomination. And he was accused of taking bribes. Another was a mayor in the Middle West who was accused of various corrupt activities. Both very good Democrats, both very pro-Kennedy, both very important in the election. And when he came back, after thinking about it overnight, came back and said, go ahead, prosecute. I think it just lifted the whole department. If that's the kind of Attorney General we have, we're going to be loyal to him. And
Great.
that was what I had in mind.
Thank you. There have been a number of legendary moments in John Doar's career, but I thought I might recount one, which was a few nights after the death of Medgar Evers in Jackson, Mississippi. There was a funeral attended by Martin Luther King and Roy Wilkins, and a few hundred black youth who had attended that funeral were singing freedom songs in the streets and were provoked by local police, and they were ordered to disperse. Soon some bricks and bottles began to be thrown when John Doar famously interceded. He reminded the youth that they were not going to get anywhere by throwing bottles and brickbats. He literally stepped in between them with these words. He said, "My name is John Doar, D-O-A-R. I'm from the Justice Department, and anybody around here knows I stand for what is right." I can't think of more fitting words to use to introduce you, Mr. Doar, and we're honored to have you here. And I thought I would just ask you again how you got involved in the Kennedy Justice Department, but especially in the matter of civil rights, and what experiences in your own personal life led to your involvement in those issues.
Well, that sounded like a good movie, didn't it?
Could you bring the mic a little closer?
That's really what it was. That before anything got to be any disorder, the police had cordoned off the end of the street leading to the main street in Jackson and made it clear that they weren't going to let the black kids march up the main street of Jackson. And there was some discussion back and forth between the police and some of the students. And I think one of the students got too close to a patrolman and bumped him, and so the police started to put students into a paddy wagon that had gone up behind where the police line was. And at that time, I'd just come out of having lunch across the street, and I noticed that the sheriff had brought up a cadre of his deputies to help seal off that end of the street. And while I had a lot of confidence in the Jackson police of being good law enforcement people, I wasn't at all sure about the sheriff's deputies. And they had shotguns. And so I thought, but I don't know really what I thought, but I just walked out, and I think it was so unusual that everything stopped. That was it. Now, I came to the Justice Department in July 1960. I was there, as they say, before the Kennedys came. And I liked what I was doing, which was managing the enforcement of the 1957 and 1960 Voting Rights Act, or Civil Rights Act, that were designed to ensure to all black citizens, black residents of any county in any state the right to vote. And before the Kennedys came, I'd had a chance to go south and had experienced some of the situations that black citizens were under in the states of Mississippi and Louisiana. And it made a mark on me, I think. And one of the cases was in East Carroll Parish, Louisiana, where a cotton farmer, 100-acre cotton farmer, black farmer, good family, good farmer, had gone down to New Orleans to testify before the Civil Rights Commission, and he explained why he was not able to vote because in his parish, East Carroll Parish, there were no blacks registered to vote, and he had to have a voucher. And the voucher, all the vouchers, of course, were white, and no white voucher would vouch for Francis Joseph Atlas. He so testified that this came out in the paper. He went back to his home and his farm in East Carroll Parish, and shortly after he got there, the sheriff came to his door and said to him, you don't bring your cotton to the gins, any gin in this parish or the surrounding parish, because your cotton won't gin. And why won't it gin, says Atlas, because of civil rights. Well, he complained to the Justice Department, and it just so happened that we filed a suit enjoining all of the ginners from refusing to gin Atlas's cotton on the 19th day of January, just the day before of the inauguration of the Kennedy administration. And it wasn't a day or so after that that Robert Kennedy came to my office in the Civil Rights Division and wanted to have a report on what was going on. And I told him that the case that was pending at the time was this case in East Carroll Parish, and that we had a hearing on a motion for temporary injunction in the next 10 days. And what I remember about Robert Kennedy was that here he was, the Attorney General. He didn't have any staff around him at that time. He didn't have any organization of, there was no Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division there. But he got into that one case for one person and put his mind and effort on it in the next 4 or 5 days, and was able to get the cotton ginned. I sometimes think you can tell a man by his conversations under those circumstances, and I remember 2 things that he said to me. The first one, he said, you picked a bad place to start. East Carroll Parish is, no blacks registered, heavy black majority. He said, you picked a bad place to start. To which I replied, well, that's where Atlas gins his cotton. we then went on from there. And then he said, the blacks were good to the Kennedys with respect to the election outcome, and he'd like to see the Civil Rights Division do something that would show their appreciation, his appreciation. And he thought maybe the place to go would be to New Orleans and intervene in the New Orleans school case. And I told him on the advice of my colleagues in this division that that was a bad place to start. And I remember he said, isn't there anybody smarter in the division downstairs than you are? I said there was, but she still couldn't do it. And we then went on with, got the cotton gin for this one single farmer in a little parish in East Carroll, Louisiana. Atlas had 12 children. He had a transit worker working in Chicago. He had a nurse daughter working in Chicago. He had 2 or 3 teachers and a couple more kids in college and 2 still at home. Just a really fine, excellent man, but just one person. And in the first days of that administration, Robert went all out to see that he was not going to be driven out of his farm and his business by an economic boycott.
I want to stick with Mr. Doar just for a minute before I introduce Mr. Goldin, but one story that he tells is that when he was first introduced to President Kennedy, Robert Kennedy said, "This is John Doar, he works in the Department of Justice, and he was here before we came," causing the president to quip, "Well, then we'll have to be careful about what we say." But I wanted to, we did a whole forum at the Kennedy Library with Mr. Doar recently about the voting rights cases, and obviously we don't have the ability to go into all of the details. They brought suit against the registrars, initially lost their cases, and had a very interesting strategy that they used in court. But I learned 2 things I thought it might be interesting, Mr. Doar, for you to comment on them. And one is, you had all these idealistic young lawyers, Mr. Goldin, who I'll introduce, representative of that type of person, you were sending down to the South to represent the Justice Department, and yet, and many of them interested in the civil rights movement and the leaders of the movement and what was happening at the community meetings, yet you advised them, maybe even required them, not to attend those meetings and be together with those civil rights leaders. Can you comment on why you chose to do that?
A little louder, please, Mr. Doar.
Mike, please, Mike.
Can you hear me now?
Better.
Well, the Civil Rights Division lawyers, there was only 5 or 6 of us working on voting cases in 1960 and 60, early 61. We did increase, go up to maybe 15 or 20 lawyers pretty fast. And these were all young, very eager and very smart lawyers from the best law schools who wanted to get into, I suppose, some action just out of law school. And when they came to the division, we had an absolute rule that we were law enforcement officers. We weren't attorneys for Dr. King, we weren't attorneys for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but we were going to enforce the law right down the middle. And of course, some of these young lawyers thought that they were walking into something like the Russian Revolution of 1918, and all the action was at these mass meetings. But you can see that if our lawyers were identified as attendance at these meetings, it would be very counterproductive for us to do something effective with respect to voting in Mississippi. We'd be labeled as just lackeys for the civil rights movement and for Dr. King and for the students, and it would be totally counterproductive. So we had an understanding with everybody that they didn't do that, and if they did do that, they came home, and then they didn't go out again.
Again, we're not going to be able to cover everything in these fascinating episodes, but I wanted to hear now from, again, one of these young lawyers who joined the Civil Rights Division right out of law school. Harrison Jay Goldin graduated from Princeton in 1957, Yale Law School in 1961, took the bar exams, passed it successfully, and then joined the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights. He and I will talk later about his elected career after he was in the division. He served in the New York State Senate and as comptroller for the New York City for 15 years. But Mr. Goldin, I imagine there are a number of students here who are 23, 24, 25 years old and would like to know, how did you land such a plum job right out of law school?
Well, first I want to thank you for inviting me to participate in this forum. It is a sign of the great pull that...
Would you get your mic right this time?
It is a sign of the great pull that Princeton has on her sons and daughters that all we need to be asked is to come to a forum and we'll show up. And I'm always glad to participate in these Princeton activities. Listening to John Doar and Nick Katzenbach, I remembered suddenly a story that I heard 50 years ago from Nick Katzenbach that seems apropos. I think it was while we were sitting around one day at Ole Miss after Meredith integrated the university that Nick said that he had been on government business and was flying somewhere, and you'll be pleased to know that he was seated in the economy section of the plane, and there were 3 passengers riding abreast, and Nick said that he was on the aisle, and next to him was a Catholic priest dressed in a clerical collar, and at the window was an elderly lady who, from the way in which she was conducting herself, seemed to be taking the very first airplane flight of her life, and she was absolutely terrified. And Nick said that as the plane took off, this woman was just beside herself, and it suddenly hit a pocket of air and began to bob around, and she turned in desperation to the priest sitting next to her and said, "Father, at a moment like this, isn't there anything you can do?" And the priest looked at her and smiled benignly and said, "Madam, I'm in sales, not management." Now, I was a foot soldier working for the generals who were sitting to my right. And the circumstances of my coming to work for the Department of Justice, I think, will illustrate to everybody in the room that life is filled with serendipity. I had accepted a job in my 3rd year of law school with a very large and important New York law firm, and imagined myself going on to a career that would emanate from that. And sometime in maybe May, I was walking down the hall in Yale Law School, and one of my instructors passed. I said hello, and he passed me, and he turned around and he said, "You got a second?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "The dean got a call this morning from the Justice Department. Attorney General Kennedy wants to assemble an elite young team of trial lawyers and has asked the dean to make some recommendations. Would you like to consider it?" I said, "No, I'm not really interested. I'm going to New York." He said, "Well, you can go down for the day. You'll meet him. The government will pay your expenses." Well, I spent the first 34 years of my life in the South Bronx. I'd never been south of Asbury Park, New Jersey. So the idea of being able to go to Washington free and spend the day seemed like a good one to me, and I did go to Washington. The Justice Department in those days had an honors program, but you had to give them a commitment that you would stay for 4 years. And during the course of that day, it was made plain to me that if I would agree to come, there would be no commitment. I could stay 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, a year, 2 years, and I could leave whenever I wanted. And so under those circumstances, I decided to give it a flyer. And that's how I came to go to the Department of Justice. Now, it occurs to me, as I was listening to Nick and to John, that for some of the people in this room, it's difficult to conjure the atmosphere in the South in those days. You've read about it, you've heard about it, you've seen movies about it, but it's difficult to relate to what it was like. And I thought of an anecdote that will give you some flavor of it. When I came to Washington in September of 1961, went to work for John Doar. He ordered me to go down to Mississippi to begin working on a voter case. I had had a Princeton classmate, a clubmate whom I knew reasonably well. His name was John Stennis. He was the son of the United States Senator, one of the 2 United States Senators from Mississippi. His father was an unreconstructed segregationist. John himself, young John, my classmate, was a member of the Mississippi legislature, apparently embarking on a career in elected politics. I knew that Jackson was not a terribly big town, and I thought that if I got there and ran into John, he might be bothered that I hadn't called him to tell him that I was coming. So I picked up the phone and I called John in Jackson. And I said, you know, I'm coming down to Jackson, but I'm not going to be able to see you. He said, well, why can't you see me? I said, because I'm going to be there under circumstances which I think mean that I shouldn't see you. He said, well, what are you going to be doing? I said, well, I'm a civil rights lawyer for the Department of Justice, and I'm going to be working on voting cases. He said to me, you meet me tomorrow night at the Jackson Club. We're going to have dinner. Oh, I said to him, John, I can't do that to you. You can't be seen with me, and you'll come up to see your father and call me, and we'll have dinner in Washington. He said, you meet me tomorrow night at 7:30 at the Jackson Club. We're going to have dinner. I said to him, well, John, is there a back door? Or... He said, no, you come in the front door. And you know, I knew at the time that that was a heroic act, which it was. And you may wonder about that, but that was the nature of the environment that existed. I remember being in Greenwood, Mississippi on one of the trips that I took, and I stayed at the home of the parents of my classmate, Harding Carter. And Mr. Carter, Harding's father, was the crusading editor of the Delta Democrat Times, way ahead of his time in terms of the progressive politics and decency that he displayed in that paper. And I remember after dinner, Mr. Carter took me into his study, and he had a roll-top desk, and he rolled it up, and he reached into the drawer and pulled out a revolver and put it right on top of the desk, and I started. And he said to me, they shot in here a week or two ago. Next time they try that, they're going to get shots back. So the atmosphere in which we worked, the environment, was one of extraordinary tension. We all felt it. We knew of it. We could sense it in the people with whom we spoke. And to bring the point full circle, as John adverted, the real heroes of this exercise were the men and women and children who were motivated to assert their rights and to be treated as American citizens. And we met them, and we were awed by them. These were people of enormous courage, great dignity, people who simply wanted to be treated like human beings. I remember, and I'm not going to digress too far, that I spent 2 weeks as James Meredith's roommate under interesting circumstances when he came on the campus at Ole Miss. And I said to him one day, what motivated you to do this? What made you want to come on this campus and integrate the school? And he said, I grew up on a sharecropper's farm, and I entered the Air Force. He said, I was 19 years old, and I went to Japan. He said, it was the first time in my life that I was treated as a human being. He said, to the Japanese, I was just another American. I'd never felt that way before. I'd never experienced that. And it made me realize that I wanted to come back home and be treated as a human being and just as another American.
Thank you. Again, we don't have time to go over all of the details of that integration, Mr. Katzenbach, but I wonder if you could share the insight you were sharing earlier of how, in many ways, it was the mistakes or how issues in the University of Mississippi played out that actually allowed the integration of the University of Alabama to go much more smoothly. You were on the ground in both cases, and if you could just share insights about what was learned in Mississippi and why you think that that was actually an effective place to have that first confrontation.
Well, I went down to Ole Miss where John Doar was in the process of starting a riot, but and I thought at the time everything went wrong. we had a whole bunch of 500 marshals there with white hats on, white helmets on, and armbands on, and uniformed, and kids coming home from football game in Jackson. And we had the Colonel Birdsong of the Mississippi Highway Patrol was there, so I'm not doing very much. And it was clear to me that our federal marshals, which were meant to support Meredith's mission, were a focus of people's attack and so forth. So anyhow, a lot of rednecks roared into town, and I guess in that part of the world you can't find a pickup truck that doesn't have a squirrel gun at least in it. And so they were there, there was shooting on the campus, they threw bricks, Colonel Birdsong and his people left. The marshals were there. We had tried to find a place to put the marshals out of sight, but we couldn't. And they were there, had all of them were armed, none of them used their arms. They were forbidden by Bobby to do it. He was absolutely right. We had people killed, a great many people injured, and a really full-fledged riot went on. We had to call in the Army, and the Army came in under General Billingsley, I guess it was. He had so many troops with him, if he kept on going, he could have retaken Cuba. They all arrived there at Oxford. And eventually the riot stopped because 22,000 armed soldiers stopped it. And I thought it was the biggest failure in the world. I thought that for a long time. More recently, I have thought that probably there had to be one incident like Ole Miss taking place somewhere in the South where people got hurt and where eventually the troops came in and they demonstrated that you're going to have to obey the law, even if it takes 22,000 soldiers to make you do it. But it was very close to a sort of another Civil War skirmish, really. But what I think that did was it told many, many white citizens in the South that resistance to equal rights just wasn't going to work, and that it was going to result in more violence, more things like Ole Miss. That was no good for business, no good for the South, no good for anybody. The governor became very unpopular as a result of not stopping this. And so when we got to the University of Alabama, we had prepared ourselves as well as we could. We didn't know what George Wallace would do, but we were fairly confident that he didn't want to riot, because that was the worst thing that could happen to him politically, would be to have a lot of violence take place. So he was going to go through his charade in the schoolhouse door. We were going to get the troops, and we thought then he would probably give up, as he did, although we didn't know about that until about noon of that day, when he told the commanding general of the guard that if he would confront him, he would leave peacefully and leave his people there to keep law and order, and that the kids would be admitted. And so they were. I don't think that would have happened but for the riot at Ole Miss. I think, this being Princeton, I really want to add another story to that. What you obviously don't know is that that was the weekend of my 20th reunion at Princeton. But it wasn't just my weekend at Princeton. The colonel who commanded the battalion that was left on guard duty was a classmate of mine at Princeton. And I saw him, and he said, "Did you pay your money for that reunion?" I said, "Yes, I did." He said, "Well, so did I." He said, "Those people up there. They're drinking your beer and they're drinking my beer.
I thought I might have you tell another somewhat humorous anecdote that afterwards you went down, this was after Ole Miss, and you ran into this Major General from the Signal Corps who was trying to understand why the Justice Department's communications system had worked so much better than the Army's during that conflict. Do you want to give him tell us what the secret was that you told him?
Well, at Ole Miss, we had set up in the basement of the courthouse a walkie-talkie system that we could use with the marshals and so forth who were out at the airport and elsewhere. But our main communication, when I went into the main building on the campus there, I put a dime in the phone and called the White House. So all evening, the president was on the phone, or Bobby was on the phone, or Burke Marshall was on the phone with me or with one of the others there, with John and others. But John was up with Meredith in his room, but asking what was going on, and we were telling them what was going on, and they said, well, the Army just arrived at the airport. I'd call the airport, and they'd say, no, nobody at the airport, they haven't arrived there yet. And the Army just could not figure this out, that they thought they knew what they were doing, but the president would call them up, and he was furious. He'd tell them they didn't know what they were doing. If they weren't at the airport, they weren't doing what they were meant to be doing. So when I got on this plane with the Major General I said, what are you doing down here? He said, be perfectly honest with you, I'm just trying to figure out why your communication system on the night of the riot was so much better than ours. And I said, well, I'll let you in on a secret, General. What you do is you go find a payphone, you put a dime in it, and you call the White House collect. But I ought to add, he didn't really believe me. When we got to the University of Alabama, our headquarters were the National Guard headquarters, and there was a phone in every office, and if you picked the phone up, you got Berlin or Warsaw or someplace. And it was a totally separate from AT&T, totally separate communication system that the Army had installed. Must have cost them several $1 million to install it. And I was scared to death to pick up one of those phones.
Let me tell another quick anecdote before I ask a question to Mr. Doar, which is also during the issue at Ole Miss. I think it was not in the height of the crisis, but General Creighton Adams was on the phone, and one of his aides came up to him and said, excuse me, General, I have the Attorney General on the line, it's very urgent. Well, he continued his phone conversation, and this young man, this aide, came up again and wrote down, Attorney General, very urgent, and he continued his call. One more time came over, underlined Attorney General, underlined very urgent, when finally Major Adams said, excuse me, Mr. President, the Attorney General is on the other phone. So, Mr. Doar, the question to you, we've talked a lot about Robert Kennedy. Can you talk some about President John F. Kennedy and the fact that these two men were brothers? And again, initially there was a sense that civil rights was not on their radar screen, but over the course of the presidency, you had a special insight into Robert Kennedy. But talk about, again, these two brothers and how they came around to support civil rights.
Well, number one, I don't really believe they came around to support civil rights. I think that they were realistic politicians as to what they could do with respect to civil rights in January 1961. After all, we got three branches of the federal government, and the President and the Attorney General controlled one of the branches, and it certainly didn't speak at that time for the legislative branch. So they had to do what they thought was the best strategy, and in the Civil Rights Division, under Burke Marshall, that strategy was to open up the vote. And I think the basis of that strategy is that the fact of the matter is that this country didn't have an honest system of self-government for 100 years before 1960. What President Lincoln had done and what he predicted would happen, what he referred to results that were fundamental and astounding, turned out to be neither fundamental nor astounding. And for 100 years thereafter, we had this dishonest system of self-government. The assignment of the president was to do something about that within the capacity and with the ability or the power that he had. And therefore, they started with a strategy to open up the vote. And the strategy was very clear. There were 7 judicial districts in the 3 states of Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi, and there were federal judges in each one of these districts, and we would get a case started in each one of these districts and keep all those federal judges busy. That was the strategy. When we presented that strategy to Robert Kennedy, he thought it was too slow, wasn't enough. There were 160 parishes in Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi. He wanted suits in all 160 counties or parishes. When he said that, Robert Kennedy said, or Burke Marshall said to him, "Well, General, if we want that, we've got to have more lawyers." And the Attorney General said, "How many do you want?" And Burke said, 4. And we got the 4. But we got a commitment to go as fast as you could, as hard as you could, as long as you could. And we then started to hire these young lawyers. And we made them work very, very hard. If they went to South on an assignment, and lawyers never went out of the Justice Department before I came, and we would insist that they go for 16 days, and they leave on a Friday night, and they'd fly to Atlanta. 2 would get off at Montgomery, Alabama. 2 would get off at Meridian, Mississippi. 2 would get off at Jackson. 2 would get off at Monroe. And 2 would get off at Shreveport. And they stayed for 16 days in the field, interviewing, investigating, checking, verifying, and came back 16 days later. Now, these lawyers in 1961 and 62 spent sometimes 175 days in the field for the whole year. Some in 1962 when we had them full over 200 days in the field. And so we amassed a lot of information, collected a lot of facts. And the second, our tactics was to try to move as fast as we could, but there was no gee whizzing about the cases. By that I mean, gee whiz, everybody knows there's discrimination, so you don't have to work to prove it. We required proof in every one of the cases, and we didn't let any of the lawyers talk to the newspaper people about what they were going to prove. But the assignment was, with that limitation, is to try to get the best headline or byline headline in the New York Times the following week with respect to some outrage. And it was occurring by the discrimination that was occurring. Now, out of that, we created a lot of frustration with the litigation, with the litigation technique of trying to do something about this. And God knows there was enough frustration with the way we were treated by the majority of the district judges in the South. But at the same time, we were able to get up to the Court of Appeals of the Fifth Circuit, the intermediate court, the Supreme Court, and we were just by an unusual series of circumstances, we developed two tactics. The first tactic was that a refusal to rule by a district judge was equivalent to a denial. And that denial enabled us to file a notice of appeal and then go to seek an injunction pending appeal with the Fifth Circuit. And that worked in one case where the Court of Appeals judges issued an order against the registrar, and he proceeded to disobey it. And so we had a contempt hearing. And since the order was issued by the Court of Appeals, not the district court, the Court of Appeals had to hear the contempt. And so Chief Judge Tuttle sent 3 judges to Hattiesburg for 5 days, in which we were offered proof of what was going on. And we were able to demonstrate how corrupt and dishonest the system was. Because the fact was at that time that if you were black and you had a college degree, you probably wouldn't be allowed to register. There would be one scheme or another that would keep you from registering. But on the other hand, if you were white and you were a resident and you breathed, you voted. And so that this combination of the frustration that occurred when we brought these cases, and we brought, I suppose, by the time Nick testified with respect to the 1965 Voting Rights Act, we brought probably 45 cases, and we probably had another 35 or 40 just ready to go. And he was able to bring out both the frustration of the litigation, but also the corruption of the actual vote. And as a result of that, combined with these crises that had come along between 61 and 65, and you can tick them right off. You can tick off the Freedom Riders in Montgomery, Meredith at the University of Mississippi, the University of Alabama, Greenwood, Mississippi, and then Birmingham, Alabama, and then finally everything came together in Selma, Alabama. And out of those combined forces, led by the pressure and the movement of the blacks, Dr. King's organization, the students, and the other organizations worked, everything came together to cause the Congress of the United States to work together with the executive branch and to pass the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And that changed the world. There's no question about it changed the world. And if anybody had any doubt about it changing the world, you come to the 2008 election. Well, that's not a very long time in historical terms, but before President Obama was elected, and before people knew that he was going to be elected, the fact was clear. Everybody who wanted to vote voted in that election. There was no discrimination against blacks. And as I say, then with his election, who can argue that this effort by the black groups from 1960 to 1965 and the support of the federal government really brought around a revolution? And it's an accomplishment that all of us can take a great deal of pride in, because in 1960, people who thought about it thought that the country was faced with an insoluble problem, the caste system in the South. And in 1966, when people thought about it, people thought that the answer to that caste system, the Voting Rights Act, was inevitable. So the history of that period is, how did something that was insoluble become suddenly inevitable?
Thank you. So, Mr. Goldin, Mr. Doar referred to these young lawyers who had to go down and travel, and I thought actually you might tell us a little bit more about your interesting experience of traveling down and being with James Meredith, and then also literally being in his room with him in the dorm room, and what it was like on campus those weeks that you shared with James Meredith at Ole Miss.
Well, as you've heard, on a Sunday, a lovely Sunday afternoon in September of 1962, Nick Katzenbach and John Doar and others brought James Meredith to register and enroll at the University of Mississippi, armed with a federal court order that said that the university had to admit him. And as Nick said, there was rioting on the campus, people were killed. That night the president mobilized the army, and by the next day the army was in evidence all over the campus. The reason I know is because the very next morning, Monday morning early, I came to my office. I happened to have been in Washington. And at 8 o'clock, the phone rang, and the woman at the other end said, "Mr. Goldin?" I said, "Yes." She said, "The Attorney General would like to see you. Would you come up to his office, please?" Well, I was 25, 26 years old, and I didn't think the Attorney General knew me at that moment. I hoped he didn't know me, but I went up to his office, and Robert Kennedy was sitting in a pose that ultimately became very familiar to Americans. He was in shirt sleeves, and his sleeves were rolled up, and he was holding a pen, and he was surrounded by a group of extraordinary young people who were advising him, people who went on to very distinguished careers in their own names, and many of them became quite well known. And he said to me, "I've been in touch with Nick Katzenbach on the campus at Ole Miss." He said, "And we've decided that we need somebody to be in the dormitory room with James Meredith so that we can coordinate his activities with Nick, who in turn is managing all of the U.S. forces represented on the campus. Border Patrol, Army counterintelligence." And the Attorney General said to me, "We need somebody who is young." I was 25, 26 years old. He said, "Somebody who was single. We know you're single. Somebody who can go home and pick up a bag and get on a plane and go down to Ole Miss." He said, "Are you willing to go?" I said, "Yes, I'm willing to go." And so that afternoon, late that afternoon, I flew from Memphis on an Army helicopter down to the campus at Ole Miss, and I remember it as if it were yesterday. It was a scene from a World War I movie with troops bivouacked all over the campus and throughout Oxford. We landed on the campus, and I was immediately taken in a Jeep to meet Mr. Katzenbach, who was, as I told him before we convened today, seated in a tent, a mess tent, on a canvas chair, eating his dinner out of cans of Army rations. And he told me that my job was to go to the dormitory room, introduce myself to Meredith, and every evening I was to ask Meredith, when we got back to the dormitory room after dinner, what his plans were for the next day, and then come and tell him so that he would be able to coordinate with the commander of all these forces how they were going to protect Meredith as he moved around the campus. And so I did that Monday night, Tuesday night. I think it must have been Wednesday night. I said to Meredith, first thing I asked him when I met him and introduced myself, "What do you like to be called?" He said, "I like to be called Meredith." I said to him every night, "What are you going to do tomorrow?" In the beginning he'd say, "Well, I'm going to go and have breakfast, and then I'm going to go to the bookstore, and then I'm going to go to my first class. Then I'm going to go and pick up some stuff that I need for school, and then I'm going to go to my second class and go to lunch." And I would go out and tell Nick, and he would get the process of protecting Meredith organized and the forces deployed. It must have been Wednesday night that I said to Meredith, what are you going to do tomorrow? He said, well, I'm going to go to breakfast and go to my first class. He said, then I'm going to go down to the athletic office, he said, to get a ticket for the opening football game on Saturday. Well, as young as I was, I said to him, you can't do that. He said to me, why can't I do that? I said, because Saturday afternoon, there are going to be, I think, 40,000 people in that stadium. I said, by halftime, half of them will be drunk. I said, you'll be the only black face in the stadium. There's just no way you can be protected and kept safe. He said to me, look, I'm on this campus because a federal court has said that I have the right to be here and to do here what every other student is doing. Saturday, they're all going to be down on that football game, and I'm going to be there too, and the job of the government is to protect me. Well, I ran out and I looked for Nick, and this was clearly above my pay grade. And Nick came into the room and remonstrated with Meredith. He said, Meredith, Jay tells me that you're planning to go to the football game. You can't go to that football game. Why not? He said, because we just can't protect you. And this was in an atmosphere when we walked out of the dormitory room. I would always walk out with Meredith when we'd go to breakfast or wherever in the morning. You must understand he was surrounded by U.S. Marshals, and on the perimeter would be FBI agents. Around the Marshals would be Army troops. We would be followed by a Jeep with what looked to me like a howitzer. There were helicopters overhead, and that was how we moved around the campus. So the notion that somehow they could be protected in the football stadium just didn't make any sense. And Meredith said to Nick, Mr. Katzenbach, I'm here because the United States District Court says I have the right to be here and to do on this campus what every other student is doing, and Saturday they're all going to be on that football game, and I'm going to be there too, and the job of the government is to protect me. Well, I had never seen anything quite like this, and he went back to doing whatever his homework was, and I was reading the newspaper, and maybe 10 minutes later the telephone rang, and I picked it up, and the voice at the other end said, this is Bob Kennedy, can I speak to Mr. Meredith, please? And Meredith picked up the phone and said, Mr. Kennedy, how are you? And he said, I don't know what he said to him. All I know is that 90 seconds later I heard Meredith say, Mr. Kennedy, I'm on this campus. Only because the United States District Court judge has said that I have the right to be here under the Constitution of the United States, to do what every other student is doing on this campus. Saturday they're all going to be at the football game. Your job is to protect me. And that ended the conversation. It must have been 15 minutes later when the phone rang again and I picked it up. And the voice at the other end said, this is Martin King, can I speak to Mr. Meredith? And I heard James Meredith say, well, Dr. King, I appreciate you calling, and flattered that you'd be concerned about my safety, but I want to tell you, here, because the United States, on this Saturday, the job of the government is to protect me. It couldn't have been 10 minutes later when the phone rang and the voice at the other end, a woman said, this is the White House. The president would like to speak to Mr. Kennedy, to Mr. Meredith. And I thought of this anecdote when John was reminiscing about the experience he had in Louisiana and commenting about how the full force of the United States of America was deployed to vindicate the rights of one citizen. And I heard James Meredith say to, I presume it was the President of the United States on the other end of the phone, Mr. President, I thank you for calling. And I appreciate you being concerned about my safety, but Mr. President, I'm here only because the U.S. District Court has said I have the right to be here under the Constitution of the United States, and your job is to protect me. Well, I'm going to tell you what the outcome of that was, but I'm going to interject that maybe 20 years later, I was already in public life, and my wife and I, my wife Diana was sitting in the front, and I had 2 children, and we took them on the obligatory trip to Washington one weekend. And at the end of a wonderful day of touring, late Saturday afternoon, I said to these 2 little boys, would you like to see where Daddy worked when he was here? Oh, yes. So we drove past the Justice Department, and I noticed something I had never observed before, that the archives is right across the street, at least was in those days, from the Justice Department. I said it'd be a nice way to end our day. We'll go into the archives and we'll see the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, which sort of is the charter of our country. We went in, and the archives then, I haven't been back since, this goes back many years, was organized as a little museum. And the way it was organized, they had alcoves on each of the preceding decades with artifacts and memorabilia and materials that were evocative of the decade. In the decade of the 60s, there was an audio exhibit, and you could press a button and pick up the phone, and you could hear the countdown of the Sputnik, and you could press another button, and you could hear President Kennedy, obviously on the phone, immediately after he hung up on that conversation with Meredith, having a conversation with Governor Ross Barnett of Mississippi. I never knew about that conversation. I heard the president say, "Ross, yes, Mr. President, we have a problem." "Yes, Mr. President." He said, "Meredith is insisting that he's got the right to go to the football game on Saturday, and there'll be carnage if we don't do something about that." And Barnett said, "Well, Mr. President, if all you Yankees hadn't started," the president said to him, "Look, Ross, we're way beyond that. We haven't got time for that. We've got to figure out what we're going to do about this." And of course, the answer was that they moved the football game to another part of the state. Now, I was a very young person. I told you that I had not started out thinking that I would go to the Justice Department, work in civil rights, spend many, many years as I did in public service. But that experience had such a profound impact on me that it changed the course of my life. I decided that for all the warts and all the failings and all the faults of this country, it is a remarkable place that there is no other place in the world that I could think of then or that I can think of today, in which citizens can speak to their leaders, as I heard this young black man speak to the President of the United States, where all the forces of the society would be mobilized to protect a single citizen. And that had the impact of changing the course of my life, and I remain forever grateful for that.
I'd just like to add that I know that some of you think a Princeton education is expensive. Just think what it cost to educate one student at the University of Mississippi.
This has been a remarkable panel. We have time just for one or two questions, and they ask for, give some preference to students. If a student or two have a question that they'd like to come up to the mic, and the sooner you do it, the better. Here's one.
Evening. Thank you for the stellar talk. My question to you, gentlemen, is what do you see as the civil rights frontiers of today?
Civil rights frontiers of today, or the challenges we face today.
Obviously, we've made a lot of progress with respect to the blacks and with respect to women. Obviously, we haven't made all the progress we should. There's a great deal of bias that still exists, and it is present in politics in this country today, just as it has been in the past, except that it's much more underground, and it's not out in front, not articulated very well. I think that's probably all one could expect. I think when we think of the passage of the civil rights bills, we didn't think, I don't think anybody could have thought, we'll pass these bills and racial bias will be eliminated. Indeed, I think in many respects, the votes for those bills came not from people who were satisfied with the principle of non-biased society, but because they wanted a society that didn't have as much violence as they thought we were getting, and it was almost an anti-violence vote that they made. But that said, we have made progress on that, and the thing that I think is worth thinking about is that equal rights of blacks, as important as that has been throughout our history, and it's nothing more important. And what we've done with respect to women is very important. But there's plenty of civil rights problems that exist today that have nothing to do with race and nothing to do with sex. We have problems of undocumented aliens. We have problems of people accused of various acts of terrorism, and we have civil rights problems connected with those that are very difficult to resolve and which face us all. So I don't think that we should think of civil rights only in terms of blacks and women's, but we ought to think of it in terms of our whole society, and that there's still plenty of work to be done with respect to blacks, with respect to women, but also with respect to other groups.
Great, thank you. Last question.
May I just, without elaborating, I would say that the struggle for civil rights at bottom was a struggle for equal opportunity. And I think the great challenge facing this nation today is the growing disparity between people of great means and people who struggle to be able to survive. I think the great challenge of opportunity today is the divide in wealth in this country. And when you consider that access to means is an important part of your access to opportunity, the phenomenon of the widening disparity between the rich and the poor, I think is deeply concerning. And that's an issue that would take at least another panel and beyond. But to me, that is the great struggle that this country faces today. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with it consistent with retaining the openness of the society, the opportunity for people to reach for the moon and achieve it? But how do we assure that those at the bottom who would like to and aspire to the opportunities that enable those who reach the top to get to where they are, to fulfill that for themselves and their children?
One might say it requires 2 years at the Wilson School and then a lifetime of public service.
2 years at the Wilson School and a lifetime of indenture to what you have to pay.
Last question.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm wondering how effective you all thought the Warren Court was in advancing civil rights.
A question about the Supreme Court, the Warren Court, and their help in advancing civil rights.
What?
The Supreme Court, the Warren Court, how effective that court was in advancing civil rights. You might talk about the federal court system in general.
Well, the Warren Court made the first step as Brown versus Board of Education. That was the start of the revolution. With respect to the work of the federal courts generally, the work of the old Fifth Circuit, the 4 or 5 judges, 4 judges on the Fifth Circuit were just heroes with respect to what the contribution they made to this revolution. If you go back and read United States versus Mississippi or United States versus Louisiana, and read those cases, they're just tremendous cases of educating the country of what the conditions were, what the actual conditions were in the South. So you can't underestimate the work of the federal court, the federal the system of federal courts to bring about these changes.
One thing that I've heard Mr. Doar note in the past as well is we mentioned that he came into the Justice Department as part of the Eisenhower administration. It was very much the judges that President Eisenhower had appointed that often really came to the aid of the civil rights advocates that are here in this panel. So I wanted to conclude with just a couple of comments. In 1966, Nicholas Katzenbach was then Attorney General, and he traveled down to Alabama and concluded a speech. It was on the anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation this way. A century ago, it was Lincoln who emancipated the Negro. A generation hence, we may very well recognize that it was the Negro that helped to emancipate the nation. So while that is no doubt true, and while we recognize the bravery and the heroism of people like James Meredith and Vivian Malone this evening, and their bravery truly is unparalleled, they would not have succeeded were it not for the talents and dedication of these three remarkable men and men like them who helped to bend the long arc of the universe towards justice, and we are a better country for it. We thank you all so much for coming.